Welcome to Life of Christ class. This will be a 14-week class where we take a look at the life of our Savior. This is not meant to be a class where we're going to go through the teachings of Christ. We won't be spending a lot of time on the different sermons or the parables, although certainly we will make reference to them as that were a large part of Jesus' ministry. But the purpose of this class is to really focus on his life, the historical aspect of his life. Where did he go? What was Jerusalem like during his time? Why did he preach about certain things to one group of people and then preach about a different set of things to a totally different group of people? Who were the Pharisees? Why did Jesus not like them? Why were the Romans in Palestine? Different things like that. We're going to look at all of the different historical contexts that surround the life of Christ. One question that sometimes I hear from people is, well, why did God send Christ to earth back when he did? Why not now? Why wouldn't he send Christ here in the modern age where you have cameras and cell phones and lightning fast internet that could spread the gospel so much faster? Why did Jesus choose the time period that he did to come here on earth? We're going to look and explore some of those things, and we're going to look at the journeys that Christ made while he was here on earth and the historical impact that his life had. Certainly, we'll get to that towards the end. So we'll certainly spend a little time talking about the Sermon on the Mount and the kingdom parables and looking at the upper room discourse in John 14, but those are really going to kind of take a sideline role where we use them to more fully explain what's going on around Jesus and in Jesus' life while he was here on earth. If you have a Bible with a map in the back of Jesus' ministry, that would certainly be helpful. I will plan on next week having a map for you guys to keep a hold of. So that way if you don't happen to have a map in the back, or you just find it inconvenient to keep flipping back and forth constantly. I know that's kind of my issue, is I don't like going back and forth. Or maybe perhaps you want a map that you can mark on as we talk about different places and historical events. I'll try to make one available to you guys so you can have that as a resource at your disposal, so that way we can keep track of where we are. And I really enjoy the idea of teaching this class because when I read the Gospels, I don't tend to read them chronologically. I tend to just read them as they were written and as they've been presented in the 66 books of our Bible. And so sometimes as I'm reading, I'll think to myself, wait, when did this happen? Where was Jesus when this occurred? Why is this suddenly a big deal? Why is it that Luke talks about this over here? But then it seems like a long time period skips, and it can be quite difficult to keep track of what's going on and when in Jesus' ministry. For example, the book of John largely takes place at the very, very end of Jesus' life, and Luke spends the most amount of time at the beginning of Jesus' life. And so when you're spreading out Jesus' biography across 4 books from 4 different viewpoints, sometimes the timeline can get lost. And that's really what I'm going to enjoy about this class, is being able to compile a timeline of Christ and see, oh, well, this miracle occurred around the time that he was teaching this. And certainly even as I've been studying, I've already found some things that I was like, well, I didn't know that before. Just because it's kind of hard to keep track. If I had a picture-perfect memory, I'm sure I could order it all in my mind, but most of us don't. And certainly if you have a chronological Bible, there are publishers that produce such things where they rearrange the Bible by time as opposed to by author. So if you have a chronological Bible, that can also be an additional resource to help you see just how things are working out in Jesus' life. I'm using one to kind of help guide my thinking as I prepare this class. But for today, we're going to largely spend our time looking at the background culture of Jesus' ministry. What's going on in Israel at the time of Christ's birth up through his death. So we will be referencing some scripture in today's class, but we're not really going to get into the actual birth of Christ today. We'll save that for next week. But we always need a historical context. I'm a history teacher. Well, that's part of my job anyways. I teach quite a few things. And as a history teacher, it is vitally important to help my students understand culture. Culture is who we are. It's our way of life. And if you can't understand a culture, there are going to be things that happen that might be that to our way of mind and to our culture seem really strange. Things like washing, for example, the washing of the hand. We always think about washing our hands for hygienic purposes, but when you look in the Bible, it takes on a spiritual significance, for example. Some of Jesus' parables talk about the Jewish dealings with the Romans, and you might be thinking, well, why is he bringing this up? Why is this a big deal? And we're going to look at that as a part of our look in the culture. But first we have to go back several hundred years before the time of Christ's birth, because Israel in the time of the New Testament is very different from Israel in the Old Testament. There are a few similarities, things like the law and certain religious groups and things like that. But if we ignore the period of silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament, we are doing ourselves a disservice in attempting to understand what happened during the time of Christ. You're going to keep seeing a date appear over and over and over again, and that's 165 BC, which was really a seminal year for the changing of the Jewish culture from what we think of in the Old Testament to what we see in the New Testament. It all starts with this idea of the Hellenization of Jewish culture. Now, if you're wondering what Hellenization means, it took me a while to figure this out too. Hellenization refers to the attempt by the Greeks to pass their culture on to everyone that they conquered through Alexander the Great. The Greeks don't actually call themselves Greeks. They call themselves Hellenes. It was actually the Romans who gave the Greeks their name because they discovered these people in an area of Italy called Grecia. And so they just assumed that everyone who spoke this language was from Grecia, Italy, and so they started calling them the Greeks. And it just stuck because, well, the Latins were the dominating cultural force at the time. But the Greeks themselves, even if you were to go to Greece today, they don't call themselves Greeks. They call themselves Hellenes from the country of Hellas. And so this term Hellenization refers to the idea of the, I guess you could say, the Greekification of a culture. And underneath Alexander the Great, most of the known world at the time was conquered, especially the eastern portion. So if you think of the Mediterranean Sea, you've got Italy, the boot, and Greece right next to it. Basically everything east of Greece had been conquered by Alexander the Great, including Persia and Egypt. And this is all during the time when the Israelites are sort of in exile, sort of not. The Israelites had been exiled from their land due to their disobedience to God, and we can see that in the books of Kings and Chronicles. And then underneath Cyrus the Great of Persia, they were allowed to go back. But then, during this time period, Alexander the Great comes to power, and he conquers Persia and all of her territories, which included Palestine. Alexander, as we know from history, didn't really do much as far as Palestine was concerned. It was kind of just a stopping point. He didn't really spend much time there or anything like that. He had far bigger fish to fry. But it would be his descendants, specifically those who would end up forming what's known as the Seleucid Empire, which would be the part of Alexander's empire that would encompass Persia and Palestine. Not to be confused with the Ptolemies, who would end up controlling Egypt. And so, as we look at the Seleucid Empire, we eventually come upon an emperor by the name of Antiochus IV, who also had the title Epiphanes, or Enlightened One. And so he comes about slightly before 173 BC, but he starts paying very close attention to the region of Palestine. It's around his time that the Roman Empire starts to become a threat to the four Greek empires. And so Antiochus decides that he's going to try to reinforce his empire, and then promptly goes to war with Rome and loses. Upon losing, he retreats back to his territories, and there he starts working on infrastructure. And one of the things for infrastructure that he works on is the bringing of Greek education into his empire. The Jews by this point had been allowed back because of Cyrus. They had done some rebuilding. They had built a new temple, or I should say rebuilt the temple that had been destroyed by the Babylonians so many years before. And they were largely obedient subjects to the Persian Empire, which is interesting given the fact that what we're going to see is that the Jews don't really have much respect for their Roman overseers, but there's not really a whole lot of pushback against the Greeks until Antiochus shows up and starts to try to enforce his own culture on them. He starts by building a gymnasium in Jerusalem, which we might think that's not really a big deal in our culture. I mean, we have gyms everywhere. Why would building a gymnasium in Jerusalem be problematic for the Jews? Because when this got built, there was a huge pushback by the Jewish people. And part of that was just how the Greeks exercised sports. If you look at ancient Greek art and things like that, they largely were, to put it mildly, unclothed while they did all these things, which was abominable to the Jewish people. And so they saw their young boys going to this gymnasium, and while they were practicing sports, doing so very, very immodestly in their minds. And so that was a huge deal to them. And so there was this massive pushback, and they said, we don't want this here. And not only that, he starts to push Greek forms of education. But this wouldn't be where he stops. He leaves Palestine for a while, because it's not Israel at this point anymore, it's just Palestine. Israel as a nation doesn't exist as we would think of as a nation. They had kind of their own forms of government, but they were basically subservient to the Greeks. Then we come to 167 BC, in which Antiochus IV commits what we know as the abomination of desolation. If you turn to Daniel chapter 11, this was actually prophesied by Daniel while the Persian Empire was still a thing, and while Alexander the Great wasn't really, well, he wasn't the Great. Certainly, he may not have even been born at this point. And so Daniel is given a prophecy in Daniel chapter 11. Excuse me, this is during the time of Darius, not even during the time of Cyrus. So this is even earlier. Daniel chapter 11 is full of prophecy, and a while ago we had a Sunday school series on Daniel in which we attempted to make clear the prophecies. It can be quite the challenge to do. And so if you were here when we did that Sunday school series, perhaps you still have the timeline and the interpretations that we handed out for that lesson, albeit that was about 3 years ago. But in Daniel chapter 11, starting in we'll start in verse 29, it says, "At the time appointed he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter, for the ships of Kittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the Holy Covenant." This is referring to Antiochus going and attacking the Romans and losing. And so he comes back and he's not exactly happy about it. "And have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." The temple was strictly for the worship of God, and Antiochus returns to Jerusalem, and there he erects a temple to Zeus, Indomitus specifically. If you were to go and study, you'll realize a lot of the Greek pantheon undergoes different name changes depending on what particular worship they're supposed to be focusing on. So while Zeus was certainly the god of lightning and storms, and he was also the god of basically government, and specifically of military might. And so Antiochus, enraged that he lost to the Romans, decides that he needs to set up an altar to Zeus Indomitus to hopefully gain him some more favor as he realizes the Romans are encroaching upon his territory. And there he sacrifices what is traditionally a pig, which to the Jewish law, pigs were unclean. And we can see that back in the Torah, the first 5 books. God has some very strong opinions against the use of swine. And so to the Jewish mind, to not only erect an idol in the temple to another god, but then to defile the altar that was there with the blood of a pig, that was too much. You know, the gymnasium was bad, the Greek education was bad, but the sacrifice of a pig on the altar in the temple of God, that was the breaking point, and there you have the Maccabean Revolution. Where you have Judas of Maccabee who gets his family and a bunch of other Jewish people together, and they revolt and overthrow the Seleucids that are there in Palestine, and that's where we get the holiday of Hanukkah, which wouldn't come until much later, or at least that's where some of it would come from, the Festival of Lights. And so there, the menorah would change the number of candlesticks from, I believe, 7 to 9 to represent the number of days that the lampstand within the temple, the lampstand that God had commanded them to build, burned without needing new oil. And so that occurs in 165 BC, and this is where you see a huge cultural change occur in the Jewish community, where previously they had been nominal in their faith and practices. In other words, they were just kind of going through the motions. Now they start to see, they're woken up and they see, hold on a second, there are other cultures out there that are trying to get rid of our identity. And so a movement starts that we're going to look at a little bit later to try to preserve the cultural identity of the Jewish people. Shortly after the Seleucids are kicked out of Palestine, the Romans show up. And there were a few skirmishes that took place, but largely Pompey the Great, who was co-ruler, you could say, with Julius Caesar, spends a lot of time cleaning out the Seleucid Empire, getting rid of the Greek influences in Persia and in Palestine, and he basically sets up a governorship in Palestine at around 63 BC. So this is about 100 years after the Maccabean revolt. So for about 100 years, the Maccabees and their descendants more or less rule the area of Palestine, free from influence from others, but then Pompey shows up with his Roman legions and subjugates the entire area under Roman rule. It's during this time that a province that we will see appear from time to time throughout the life of Christ, known as Decapolis, becomes established, and it's put under the rule of the governor of Syria, who we will see a little bit later on in Christ's life. So Decapolis refers to the 10 cities on the eastern side. It's kind of into the northeastern side of Israel. If you look at your map of Bible times, you'll see there's an area up to the east of the Sea of Galilee known as Decapolis, and it just refers to the 10 cities that were put under the command of the Syrian governor there. To try to keep the peace, Pompey and Julius Caesar established governors there, but due to the civil war that would eventually happen between Pompey and Julius Caesar, it won't be until Julius Caesar's nephew and his co-ruler Mark Antony come onto the scene about 20 years later that we see Herod the Great coming onto the throne. Palestine traditionally for the Romans was very difficult to hold on to, very difficult to keep the peace. They did not really welcome the Romans, probably thinking back to when Antiochus came through, that, where the Greeks had tried to Hellenize them, the Romans were going to try to Latinize the Palestinians as well. So there was a lot of pushback from the Palestinians, and so in order to try to keep the peace, Octavian, who we know as Augustus Caesar, attempts to establish a king who was a native to the area. And so Herod did have some claim to a throne, certainly not the throne of Israel, not being a son of David, but due to some political things that were going on there that we don't have time to get into, basically Herod kind of betrayed his family and worked his way up to the top, and then went to Octavian and Mark Antony and said, "Can I be king of Palestine?" And Octavian and Mark Antony, who already at that time period were kind of going at it themselves, basically said, "Sure, you can have it, you can be king." And so they establish him as king of Judea. And we actually get a time of prosperity. I'm not going to say peace. There still certainly were factions within the Jewish culture that rebelled against having an Edomite on the throne, because Herod's lineage actually took him back to that of Esau. So there were some purists who viewed Herod as being a usurper to the throne of David, and certainly he was, not being of the family of David, and not even being fully Israelite himself. But largely we start to see a period of prosperity where Herod actually starts out doing a really good job in Palestine. Taxes are being collected, the Roman roads are being built, there's a lot of infrastructure that's going on, and things actually are starting to look well for the region known as Palestine. They actually do prosper and do well underneath Roman rule, which is something that, I don't really think of when I'm reading through the Bible, because that's not the focus of the Bible itself. But certainly if you look at the differences between Jerusalem in the Old Testament, especially after the time of Solomon, and Jerusalem in the New Testament, there's a marked difference in just how much political influence Jerusalem has as the center of government. And so I'm not going to, certainly Herod did some pretty horrible things. He ended up going completely mad and killed a bunch of his family. And then, of course, we have that passage in Matthew where he commits infanticide in the town of Bethlehem as a part of his madness, because as we're going to see, when you come to the throne by political machinations and by treachery, you're going to be afraid of someone doing the same to you. Yes. And so that, combined with diseases that he would have had, that historians and anthropologists have basically figured out he had quite a few intestinal diseases and other diseases, and all of that kind of combined would have brought on the madness that we see when we get to Matthew chapter 2. But for the first portion of his reign, things worked out really well. And so that's important to understand, that while yes, we see Mad King Herod in the book of Matthew, he was not always that way, and it brought out this prosperity in the land of Palestine. Next, we're going to look at so we've established a historical context. We see how we've gotten here. It started with the exile, then moved to the Persians controlling Palestine and letting the Israelites go back, to Alexander the Great and Antiochus Epiphanes, and then finally to Pompey and Herod, which is where we're going to stop our historical narrative for the time being. And now we're going to take a look at some of the customs that we see around this time period that the Jews had. There are a lot of things that perhaps, if you've studied the Bible for a good portion, read a lot of literature about these, certainly none of these things may take you by surprise. But looking at the mindset of the Jews is important when we are trying to understand why it is that a new covenant was made. why was there a new covenant? Why did God bring about the church? Why did suddenly it go from just being Jewish-centric or Israel-centric to what we call Gentile-centric, or anyone who isn't a Jew? Why did all that happen? Well, some of that had to do with some beliefs and customs that would come up. During this time, we see the rise of the synagogue. You do not see the term synagogue used in the Old Testament. It's not there. The term synagogue is actually a Greek term. It just means a place where people gather. And the synagogues show up at about 300 BC. Prior to this time, all worship was done at the temple or the tabernacle. After the temple was destroyed, well, the Jewish people didn't really have anywhere to worship. And so to compensate for there not being a temple, this idea of almost like a house of worship comes into play, and it gets the Greek title synagogue. It's usually led by a rabbi, and synagogues are still in existence today. Many towns have one or more in them, and they operate very similarly. Obviously not all the way, but they fulfill the same function as what we as Christians would say the church fulfills. It's a gathering place for people of like faith to worship, to pray, to study the scriptures together. And whereas the church, the head of the church is the pastor, or at least the physical head of a church is the pastor, in a synagogue it's the rabbi. But here's where things deviate. A rabbi is not needed for a synagogue to function. If a church does not have a pastor, that can be quite problematic. But the way that a synagogue is set up, it's set up so that anyone can take the leadership role whenever there's a meeting. In fact, in many synagogues, they don't even have a rabbi, and just the functions of the rabbi get distributed out through the male heads of household in that particular Jewish community. And usually they'll lead in the reading, they'll do the singing and things like that. And so it is typically supposed to be led by a rabbi, but the rabbi could pretty much be anybody. And there's nothing within the context of the synagogue that says a synagogue has to have a rabbi. So whenever you see the term rabbi being used in the New Testament, rabbi just simply means a teacher. And usually they were found heading up the synagogue. Their functions were, they were to be a house of prayer. Basically, the Jewish community could go to a synagogue and offer up prayers. It was also the center of Jewish education. The Jewish culture was, I would say, not necessarily unique, certainly unique when we come to the medieval era, where education pretty much goes by the wayside. But they did adopt this idea that everyone needed to learn how to read, and especially how to read the Torah. And so Jewish boys, for the most part, would be sent to synagogue when they were younger to learn how to read, so that way as they would develop and grow into men, they could take on that part of the rabbi, should they be called on to do so, and be able to read the Torah. So they would go there to learn to read, they would learn the different laws, they would learn how to write many times. So it was a religious school, a religious education institution. Certainly they would have learned other things there, but when we think of school, we think, learning science and history and, language arts and mathematics and things like that. And some of those things certainly did take place, but it was all within the context of learning the law. So whatever science you learned, it was related to the law. Whatever history you learned, it was related to the law. Whatever mathematics you learned, it was related to the law. Everything went back to the Torah. And every Jewish boy who was able to would come and would learn. Within each one, you also have their version. It's obviously not the Ark of the Covenant, but they would have a box that they call an ark that would contain the scroll that would have the Torah in it and possibly other religious writings. not every synagogue would have the law and the prophets and the poetry and anything like that. And we'll actually get into the reason why in a bit. So certainly there would have been some synagogues that the only thing you would have found there was the first 5 books, the Torah, what we call the Pentateuch or the Law. But in most of them, given the particular religious group, the Pharisees, who were largely in control of the synagogues, they would have also had the prophets and poetry books and things like that as they were available to them, which is why when Jesus goes to the synagogue and is asked to read, first of all, that suddenly makes sense why they would just ask this seemingly random stranger who walked in to read. That's common in a synagogue. It's not just the pastor who gets up to stand up and speak. Anybody in the synagogue could. And so when we get to that point in Jesus' life, suddenly it makes sense. Oh, this is why they asked him to read and not, the sitting rabbi at the moment, and why he's able to read from the book of Isaiah. So these are some modern synagogues. I couldn't find, the ancient synagogues are largely destroyed, so all you see are a couple of columns. But the modern synagogues oftentimes are very ornate. They do have a sanctuary very similar to what we would think of as like a cathedral type sanctuary, where you have the rows of pews where people sit. At the front they'll have this special area where they keep their Torah scrolls. When you go into a synagogue, they will usually ask you to keep your head covered, and they'll provide head coverings for you if you are there. When you're there and they bring out the Torah, everyone is supposed to stand out of respect for it. Although Gentiles who are, I went and looked up some of the rules that make Gentiles fall if you were to go into a synagogue. One day I hope to actually go visit a synagogue and see a service just to kind of get a true feel for it. And so I looked up some rules that a Gentile would have to follow in a synagogue, and certainly if they make you wear a head covering, you have to stand in the presence of the Torah. And then usually the congregation will read whatever passage there is out loud, and you're welcome to follow along or to remain silent. They usually try not to force practices, just kind of like how our church here, if you're there to just observe, we don't force you to participate in anything. But there are a couple things that they would make Gentiles follow in a Jewish synagogue. And so certainly not all of them are as ornate as this, but many of them are. Moving on then, we come to the temple. So we see synagogues used frequently through the New Testament, and especially in Acts, but then we come to Herod's temple. The first temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians and to a certain extent rebuilt when the exiles returned from Persia, but that is not the temple that we see in the New Testament, and especially in the Gospels. The temple that we see in the New Testament is known as Herod's temple, or the second temple. First of all, it was surrounded by a great plaza, and I've got a picture showing up later, but I'm just going to kind of describe to you what Herod went through to build this thing. He did not, this is from the Jewish Virtual Library, an article written by someone named Shelley Coney. And this just kind of illustrates just how much effort Herod went through to try to please the Jewish population. In order to meet the enormous increase in the capacity the temple required for all the different festivals and to comply with the limitations placed on its dimensions by Jewish law. If you read how God told Solomon to build a temple, the Jewish leaders wanted to follow that. But there were decidedly many more Jewish people in Palestine by the time Herod comes to the throne than there were during Solomon's day. We're talking in the order of millions more. And if they were all supposed to come to the temple to worship, Solomon's temple wasn't big enough. So in order to comply with these limitations, Herod built a great plaza around the temple. This plaza is what we now know as Temple Mount today, where the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque stand. In order to construct this platform, Herod built a box around Mount Moriah. Okay, so he built this giant stone box around Mount Moriah and then filled it in. The plaza covered this box completely and expanded the available land at the peak of the mountain. It's approximately 480 by 300 meters, which is about the size of 6 football fields. The retaining walls of this box were themselves cause for wonder, and the western wall is one part of this western retaining wall. So the Wailing Wall, or the western wall that you could go and see in Israel today, is not actually a wall of the temple. It's one of the retaining walls that was built by Herod to expand the amount of space the temple had available to itself. They're 5 meter thick, weighing up to 2 to 100 tons. One particular stone apparently weighs 400 tons, which is very difficult to move even by modern machinery standards, and these people were using hand tools. The average stone's about 10 meters. There is no mortar in the stones, but they are fit so well together that it's very difficult to even fit a piece of paper in between them, and that's hard for engineers even today to accomplish. Herod truly went all out when building this temple. He knew he wasn't popular. He knew that the Jewish people viewed him as a usurper, being an Edomite and sitting on the throne of David. And so he went to great lengths to try to appease the Israelite people, and especially in the construction of this temple. It was made, the central temple, what would actually be called the temple proper, was made of marble and gold, said to be so bright that it would be impossible to look at noon without going temporarily blind from how much gold and white was used in its construction. It did contain a central bank within its grounds to exchange Roman currency for temple-approved currency, because the temple would not accept the Roman dinar in its walls. And so if you were to visit the temple and you needed to buy something for the appropriate sacrifices, you would have to exchange your Roman currency, which was the most commonplace, for a special temple currency, which we are going to see is going to become a little bit more important later on in the life of Christ. But that was why. They did not want Gentile money passing the walls of the temple, and so a business centered around making a special temple currency that could only be used in the temple. You couldn't take the temple currency out and use it elsewhere. You had to use it within temple grounds. So here's kind of a picture of Herod's temple. This interior section, that is the temple proper, but most of the people would gather around these columned areas and in this central plaza area. Being its size being so small, very few people would be allowed, relatively speaking, would be allowed into the actual temple itself, this center structure representing the Holy of Holies and the holy place. So most people would gather here, and this was a common gathering place. You didn't just go here during festivals or during the Sabbath day. You could come here at basically any time, and often you would have groups gathering where there would be teaching going on. Rabbis would often gather there, and lawyers would come to debate the law here. And so it was a gathering place, more than just used for religious purposes. Next, we have a group known as the Pharisees, and I've referenced them already, but they come up. They do not show up in the Old Testament because they did not come around until 165 BC. They were established shortly after the Maccabean Revolt, and their whole purpose was to protect Jewish identity. They watched the Greeks basically try to undermine everything that the Jewish culture stood for, and so they said, we are going to put a stop to that. We are going to try to protect our identity. We are going to try to pass down our traditions and our laws to future generations so that the Israelites never forget who they are, where they came from. And so they developed this, I guess you could call it a sect of Judaism around this idea of cultural protection. They did believe in the law that was given by God, but they believed in a twofold law. There was, of course, the written law, which is, as I've stated, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But they also followed what was called the oral law or traditions. And this would include things like the prophets that would come and the judges. So it wasn't just limited to Deuteronomy. So many of the things that they taught, including things by Isaiah, David, Solomon, the judges, and other prophets, those would all have been included. So when we talk about the oral law or the traditions, understand that some of what we consider to be a part of the Old Testament fits into that category. It's not just everything that the Pharisees made up. There are things that the Pharisees consider oral law that we would also say is a part of the Old Testament. But here is where the Pharisees become problematic. They do not believe in a rigid interpretation of the law. In other words, the law wasn't just to be followed as stated. The law was meant to be reinterpreted to fit contemporary uses. And this is where you'll see, we've heard, I'm sure, some of the ridiculous rules about, how much milk you could drink, or, how to properly crack an egg so as not to do work on the Sabbath day, or how far one could walk on the Sabbath before it being considered work. Different things like that. All of that comes from their reinterpretations of what the law should be. Basically, they said, well, the law says don't work on the Sabbath, so in our current society, work means doing this, this, and this. And even today, these reinterpretations still come up. For example, in some very rigid Jewish households, they will not flip a light switch on the Sabbath day. That is considered work. And that comes back to this idea that the law should be reinterpreted to fit society. I mean, light switches weren't around when God gave the Torah back to Moses. But the Pharisees reinterpreted it to fit with modern society. Now, the Pharisees, as we see them in the Bible, don't exist today, but their teachings would get passed on. They're not the only group, and I'm going to have to end here. This would be kind of the standard garb of the Pharisees back in the day, with the robes, and they would often also have little boxes of scripture on their hands and forehead. But where we're going to have to end today is the Sadducees. We see the Pharisees quite frequently, but we also see another group known as the Sadducees. These were this was the high priest and the aristocracy. These were the rich people in Jewish culture. And they had a decidedly different approach to the law. These were the people who, when you see groups like the Sanhedrin, or it talks about Caiaphas, the high priest, often the Pharisees will get called lawyers, and the Sadducees will get called priests, because many of them fulfilled the function of the priest. Many of them were Levites. They believed that the Torah was the only divine revelation. In other words, only the first 5 books to the Sadducees were the scriptures. Anything else, the Judges, the books of poetry, the Kings and Chronicles, the prophets, none of that was divine revelation. Sure, the prophets may have been guided by God, but their words were not divinely inspired to the Sadducees. So if it didn't come from the first 5 books, it wasn't scripture to them. And this gave them some rather interesting beliefs, especially considering the soul. Basically, because the Torah does not speak to the immortality of the soul, to the Sadducees, once you died, that was it. No eternal destination, nothing. You just died and ceased to exist. And so there was no such thing to them as life after death. There was no paradise, there was no heaven, there was no hell, there was nothing. You just lived and you died, and that was it. And this put them in contention with the Pharisees, who taught that there was an immortal soul and that there was life after death. And so the Sadducees and the Pharisees were often at odds with one another, but as we're going to see, they would not always be at odds one with another. Sadly, we don't have time to get into the Sanhedrin, but basically, to wrap things up, it was just the Jewish council, the legislative and judicial and spiritual council. They really had no temporal authority as far as the Romans were concerned, but as far as Jewish law was concerned, they were the top of society. Sadly, I don't have time to linger here because we do need to be wrapping up here. But some other things that the Jews believed was in a Unitarian God. God was one in and of himself, and that was it. They believed that you could only worship at the temple in Jerusalem, especially the Sadducees. The Sadducees hated the idea of a synagogue. They wanted to keep all their power, and so they said you could only worship at the temple in Jerusalem. And then the Jews do believe in a Messiah, but a Messiah that would grant Israel political autonomy, which is going to become very, very important as we move through the life of Christ. So next week we're going to look at the birth and early life of Christ. I do appreciate you all coming and your patience and your listening ability, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.